When I was preparing this talk or doing research, I came across this Pathy News. Now, it's a video, I suppose you'd call. It was 5 minutes long. I've cut a chunk out just to have it scrolling around, but it shows the loading, delivery, and erection of some of the prefabs that were brought to Northern Ireland in 1949. And I think it's amazing when you see further on in the video when they're actually, it's like buying something from IKEA, right? You end up with 20 parts or whatever, and you're fiddling around with them, and you're always left with one piece, right? Now, that truck, and each of the trucks that came in this delivery, each truck had everything that was needed to erect and supply one prefab. It included the side panels, the interior walls, the doors, the ceiling, the roof, the electric cooker, the water heater, the clothes washer, and fridges, bathroom, toilet, WC, wash hand basin. I'm just going to let this run to the end of its sequence, and then I'll start the real. That's it coming out of Larne. You can tell because it says Larne. This is them arriving. Hawksley Transport were the people that transported the stuff, the bits and pieces. And these are the guys starting to put together a prefab. Up we go. And it's when they bring the cooker in through the roof. That's the bit that got me when I first saw it. There's the bath going in. And look at the young fella that's carrying the shirt and tie. I bet that was the only time he had a shirt and tie on at the site. That's the fireplace. Came complete. The windows and everything were already in the panels. There's the roof going on. Come on, boys, heave, up we go. There's the cooker going in. There's the ensuite bathroom. I mean, that's just a fantastic piece of history. Right, okay, I'm gonna. So, post-war housing in Northern Ireland. There was a move to get rid of the slum housing in Belfast and other major towns and cities. And there were a number of different approaches to this. Of course, Belfast Blitz, the German air raids, had left large parts of Belfast with no housing. People who had been displaced from their houses were living with relatives or with friends in cramped conditions, and they needed new housing. They needed a lot of new housing. The first approach was the Nissen huts. And so there were three phases. There were Nissen huts, and then there were prefabs, and there were two types of prefabs. Arcon prefabs, which are these ones here, and the Hawksley prefabs. It was the Hawksley prefabs that were on that wee video clip. Nissen huts, these are the Nissen huts at Orangefield, where there was an army camp. And the initial idea for providing temporary emergency accommodation was to convert Nissen huts into residential accommodation. So you might have one Nissen hut being formed into two units for a small family, or kept as one unit for a larger family. By the end of October 1947, 925 Nissen huts at 24 military camps in Northern Ireland had been converted to provide 891 residential units. The three largest sites were Springtown near Londonderry, where there were 180 Nissen huts, Woodville near Lurgan, where there were 90 huts, and Victoria Park in Belfast, where there were 85 huts. Victoria Park, one of the regiments that was based there, lost several members in the German air raids. Samuel and Florence Wellington lived at Hut 20 in Victoria Park, and they were living there when their son Samuel died at the Northern Ireland Fever Hospital on 18th June 1951, aged 1. The Wellington family later moved from the Nissen huts to the nearby Arcon prefabs at Park Avenue. And these were erected right down at the end of Park Avenue, literally where it moves into Victoria Park. The location of Nissen huts has not been very well documented. So, and it's very difficult to identify people that lived in particular locations. So I'm not going to say an awful lot more about the Nissen huts. I heard today, to preempt any questions, I heard today that railway carriages were also converted to be used for emergency accommodation up at Lisnabrini. I only found out about that today, so I haven't been able to verify whether that's true or not. But that gives you another indication as to the desperation that there was. People living in a railway carriage. Okay, the railway carriage would have been stripped of all seats and would have been converted to provide accommodation, but still living in a railway carriage. In August 1945, the Northern Whig reported that Belfast Corporation Estates Committee had applied to the government of Northern Ireland for 1,000 prefabricated houses on the same terms accorded to local authorities in Great Britain. Under this scheme, the local authority would supply and prepare each site, including provision of roads, electricity, water and sewerage, and so forth. So all the pre-work would be provided by the council, and then the government would supply and erect the bungalows. In the event, the Ministry of Health and Local Government secured 2,000 prefabricated houses for bungalows in Northern Ireland in 1945, and secured arrangements for another 2,000 in 1948. So these are broadly termed ministry prefabs to distinguish them from prefabs that were erected by local councils off their own bat. Two phases: Arcon prefabs, which were erected, 2,000 of them erected around about 1946 into 48. And then the Hawksley, 2,000 Hawksley semi-detached bungalows, which were built or erected 1949 through to about 1951. There were as I mentioned, other prefab schemes that were not organised through the ministry, and they're not as well documented because each council was basically doing their own wee thing. September 1945, the Northern Ireland Housing Trust, the precursor of the Housing Executive, announced that it was in negotiation with the Orlet Company for the erection of permanent prefabricated houses. Newspapers reported that 400 permanent houses, factory-built 3-bedroom houses, would be manufactured in a new Orlet Company factory in Northern Ireland. I think it was in Lisburn, and they were to be erected in Belfast. But I don't know where they were erected. I can't find any documented evidence or documented records. I know there was some erected in Tyrone near Cookstown, but again, I don't know where. And it's very difficult to try and track those without any documentary evidence.
Some being built in Lisburn.
Yeah, well, I know they were built, the Orlets. This is an example. This is what the Orlets that were going to be erected in Belfast looked like. They were concrete edged, unlike the prefab bungalows, which I'll come to in a minute. So there were councils would have done their own thing, and all those records would be held by individual councils, whereas the ministry records are all held at PRONI, and I can get access to them, even though some of them had to be redacted for me. But still, I was able to get some fantastic detail and information from the files at PRONI, including a list of all the Nissen huts that were converted to army and where they were and how many Nissen huts and how many residential accommodation. I was able to verify where all of the 2,000 Arcon prefabs were erected, and from other sources how many of the 2,000 Hawksleys have been erected. So it's a fantastic amount of information, but that information is not there for the Ulster cottages or for the Orlet houses. Anyway, so what I'm going to do in the talk, now that we're sort of through that sort of initial wee phase, is I'm going to talk about the Arcon prefabs, and I'll explain what an Arcon prefab is, and then details of the various schemes in Belfast I'm then going to do the same for the Hawksleys. And I'm going to put in some details of people that lived in the houses, because you can track them using the Belfast street directories. So you can go in and you can see who was living at number 1 Westland bungalows in 1949, and where that person, how long they stayed in the bungalow. I have plotted using Google Maps where all of the Arcon locations were erected. None of them remain. But from the maps, from the details in PRONI, I've been able to piece together where they were physically located. And the maps, my maps is quite specific as to the street name or whatever. So Belfast was allocated 1,000 Arcon prefabs, and they were erected at 14 locations. In addition, another 135 Arcon prefabs were erected by Belfast Rural District, and they were erected at White House at a place called Rural Avenue, which is now, it's now got a different name. The Rural Avenue doesn't exist anymore. And 100 were erected at Ballybean by Castlereagh Rural District. So in effect, there were 1,235 Arcon prefabs built in what we could term Greater Belfast. This is a museum example of a prefab. So obviously some of these were retained. Now, obviously this has been cleaned up, but it's been dismantled from somewhere, cleaned up and put together as a museum piece to show what they look like. The Arcon Mark V detached bungalow was designed by Mr. Rodney Thomas of Architectural Consultants, Arcon. That's where the name came from. They were manufactured by Taylor Woodrow Construction Limited, and Mr. McHugh, the general manager of Taylor Woodrow, said that the bungalows had an expected lifespan of 50 to 100 years, which is over-egging it just a bit. And he also said that they were only classified as temporary because the floor area was only about 650 square feet, whereas a permanent home was expected to have a floor area of 900 square feet. So that was his way of saying this is temporary, not because they won't last, but because they're not big enough. Unfortunately, the councils that had bought into this program, into this process, didn't really buy that. And they expected an Arcon prefab to last about 10 to 15 years. The local authorities, as I said, expected they would last about 10 to 15 years. The Arcon bungalow had a floor to ceiling height of 7 feet and 6 inches, so plenty of headroom, and had a frontage of 32 feet and a depth of 21 feet. The exterior walls and roofs were made from pressed asbestos. Ooh. Now, pressed asbestos is not, from my limited understanding, as dangerous as the fibers. So it didn't have the same health risks. But when you say asbestos, people immediately start thinking, hang on, my grandparents lived in one of those, I'll put in for a claim. So I don't think they were intrinsically dangerous to people's health. But then I didn't live in one, so I don't know. This is the floor plan of an Arcon bungalow. And as you can see, it had a living room, 2 bedrooms, a fitted kitchen, bathroom, lavatory, and outside coal shed. The outside coal shed was made from Anderson air raid shelters. So a very, very early example of recycle, restore, reuse. But when you think about it, all these houses had small Anderson air raid shelters. What better than to continue using them, but use them either for cold storage or for storing hammers and saws and so forth. The kitchen came equipped with a refrigerator. 1948, you're moving into a new house and it has a refrigerator in the kitchen. That would have been luxury for the people moving into these houses. But it also came with a cooker. a clothing wash boiler, and an immersion heater. And this was all included. You didn't have to go out and buy, you didn't have to go down to B&Q or Homebase or whatever and say, well, when you moved into the house, it had the washer machine, it had the refrigerator, some of which were gas powered. Now, I'm not quite sure how a gas powered refrigerator works, but there you go. And the cooker, all done. As you can see, built-in cupboard space in all the rooms, meters, coats, worktops, sink, larder, folding down table, and shelves and so forth, all inbuilt to make the absolute best use of all the space. And people moving into these were designed for families between 2 and 6 members, people in a family, unless there were more children under the age of 10, in which case they would allow 8 to 10. Now, I'm thinking, well, hang on, if you're saying you got 6 children under the age of 9, in 5 years' time, they'll all be teenagers. So they didn't really take account of that, but in some cases, there were a lot more people living in an Arcon, because once it was allocated, maybe if family were looking for somewhere to stay, they all piled into the Arcon. This is the bones or the skeleton of an Arcon prefab that was erected at the Shore Road as an exhibition example. Demonstration bungalow, and it was inspected by Mr. Grant, Minister of Health and Local Government, on Friday the 12th of April 1947. Sorry, 1946. So they had the first one up. You can see the trams in the background. These were at Shore Road, and the article, it was an advanced copy, if you like. They also had one down at Ballyhalbert, which was the central depot, which was used by the erection companies to practice. So they would go there to Ballyhalbert and they would erect and dismantle until they knew how to do it. 24th of April 1946, the Belfast Telegraph reported that the parts for 50 prefabs had arrived at Pollock Dock on SS Dorothy Rose, and they'd been taken to the central depot at Ballyhalbert Airfield. The Arcon bungalow had 2,500 parts to make up one detached bungalow. Like I said, it would be like going to IKEA. By the end of 1946, 226 prefabs had been delivered to sites, 200 in Belfast, 12 in Portadown, 9 in Portrush, 5 in Londonderry. 30 bungalows were ready for occupation at the beginning of September 1946. 10 each at Shore Road, Orangefield and Stranmillis. The 2,000 Arcon prefabs had all been erected by the end of June 1948. And one of the names that cropped up time and time again as being involved in the construction was William Logan and Sons of Limestone Road, and they were contracted to erect the Arcon prefabs at several locations in Belfast. So how long did the prefabs last? In some of the rural areas, some of the rural districts, this dismantling started in the late 1950s. Dundonald, they were all removed, I think, by about 1965. Donaghadee, they were all gone by 1964. In other locations, it was in the 60s. But in Belfast, in November 1961, Mr. J.H. Swan, the city architect, delivered a report to Belfast Corporation which recommended the dismantling of the Arcon prefabs over a 10-year period. The process eventually took 20 years, over 20 years, to be completed. I don't have the details for when all the ones disappeared in the outside of Belfast, but I know that the last Arcon prefab in Belfast, and probably in Northern Ireland, was on the Ravenhill Road. And this is the one which Aidan Campbell knows about. The houses between the Royal Bakery and Shamrock Street and Ravenhill Road had been demolished by 1932, and the site remained vacant until 4 Arcon bungalows were erected at numbers 100 to 106, so right on the corner of Ravenhill Road and Shamrock Street. The occupants are first recorded in the 1949 street directory, and numbers 100 and 104 were recorded as vacant ground in the 1970 street directory. That means they'd been dismantled and the sites had been cleared and it was ready for construction of something else. 2 of the bungalows were still occupied in 1974. Ernest Brown, a packer, was living at number 102, and Miss Margaret Douglas was living at number 106. In the 1986 street directory, the prefab plots had been swallowed up by Childshurst Commercials Limited, which occupied 46 to 106 Ravenhill Road. That was obviously long before Boucher Road and so forth came into existence. This is a photograph of what I think is the last prefab in Belfast and probably Northern Ireland. The photograph was taken in 1982. And by that stage, you can see there's still curtains, but it's unclear whether anyone was still living in the property. Ernest Brown, a machine man, was recorded as the occupant at this prefab in the 1950 street directory, and he lived there with his wife Mary until his death on the 28th of September 1979, aged 67. So that's 30 years that he and his wife, and I don't know whether they had any children, but they lived in this prefab for 30 years, and they were supposed to be temporary. Miss Mary Brown continued to live in the prefab until at least 1982 and was living at 166 Kings Road when she died in November 2003, aged 88. Ernest and Mary Brown are buried in Roselawn Cemetery. It's a pity the trees are there, otherwise you'd have got a much nicer view of that. And of course, other units had been erected around it, so it was an island sitting there waiting to be demolished. The largest concentration of Arcon prefabs was at a site between the Shore Road and Belfast Lock, on land marked in the historical maps as, quote, likely to flood. Where better to build houses than on a floodplain? But again, bear in mind, they were only supposed to be there for 10 years or thereabouts. The site had an area of 30 acres, and the Shore Road frontage was just about a mile in length, and 390 Arcon prefabs were erected under 3 contracts. 184 were erected here and were called downview bungalows. You'll need to turn your heads upside down to read that. And the others, 131 were completed by end of December 1946 and were called Lockside bungalows. And then a further 75 were added to Lockside bungalows in 1947. A Belfast City Mission Hall was erected on the site here. And the, the 1919 Fort William Squadron of the Air Training Corps was later established at premises at Lockside Bungalows. And it was over here, that we isolated bit there is where the air cadets met for training. This is a newspaper photograph, quite good quality for newspaper, I think, which shows the bungalows at Lockside. There were just rows and rows of bungalows. It's a bit like going to a caravan park in Portrush or something, where you just have all the houses laid out. 21 of the 390 prefabs at the Shore Road site were occupied by the same family from 1948 until shortly before they were dismantled. Charles Doherty was recorded as living at 55 Lockside bungalows in the street directory from 48 to 68, when 28 of the prefabs were still occupied. Patrick Byrne was the occupant at 13 Downview bungalows from 1948, and Mrs. Rebecca Byrne, his wife, was recorded as the occupant in the 1960 and 1965 directories. Rebecca won £150 on the YP pools in February 1960. Anyone remember pools? Anyone still do the pools? It's all online now, isn't it? 150 quid in 1960. Around about 3,000 quid in current terms. So not bad for a couple of shillings put down. This is an aerial view from the Britain from above, showing the full extent of the bungalows at Shore Road. It's a great photograph, isn't it? And you can see this is Donegal Park Avenue running up to the Antrim Road. And then you've got, I think, Alexandra Park Avenue. That's Fort William Park, I think, there. So, you know, it's as a snapshot of what it was like. But you can see how densely packed together they were. The 1968 Belfast Street Directory records that 36 prefabs were still occupied at the Shore Road site, and all the prefabs had been dismantled by the time the 1969 Street Directory was compiled. So the street directories, if you're looking at the 1969 street directory, that records the people who were living there in 1968. So you've got to always consider you're running a year behind. So the houses there would have been dismantled, finally dismantled in 1968. Westland bungalows. There were 125 Arcon bungalows at the Cave Hill Road end of Westland Road. The estate was completed by 31st August 1947. In the 1970 street directory, only 2 of the bungalows were still occupied. Joseph Miller, a civil servant, was living at number 23, and Mrs. Emily Kerr was living at number 60. All the prefabs had been dismantled by the time the 1971 street directory was compiled. The original occupant at 55 Westland bungalows was a veteran of the Second Anglo-Boer War. And that's not him there. This is him here. 2 South Africa medals and what I think is an Ulster Special Constabulary medal. But because of the quality of the photograph and because it's black and white, I can't be 100% certain. But I've been told it's an Ulster Special Constabulary medal. This is David John Griffiths, who was a tailor when he enlisted with the Royal Irish Rifles on 17th November 1888 at the age of 18. Stationed at Newry Barracks when he married Sarah Jane Copeland on 25th September 1894 at Newry Parish Church. Served with the 2nd Battalion Royal Irish Rifles in the Second Anglo-Boer War and took part in the Battle of Stormberg on 10th December 1899. In that battle, his battalion lost 4 officers and 216 other ranks. David was discharged in December 1901 and received a war gratuity of £5 in January 1902, and that equates to £521 in current terms. He was a long-term member of the Royal Ulster Rifles Association, so after the First World War, there had been the Royal Irish Rifles Association, and then whenever the Royal Ulster Rifles was, when that regiment became the Royal Ulster Rifles in 1922, it became the RUR Association. And he was still attending public events for the Royal Ulster Rifles Association when he was in his 90s. He was the oldest member on parade when he attended the Battle of Stormberg Memorial at Belfast City Hall in December 1964. Sarah Jane Griffiths died on 4th September 1964, aged 91, and was buried in Dundonald. David Griffiths died at 55 Westland Bungalows on 20th April 1965, aged 94, and is buried in Roselawn Cemetery. Unsure why he's not buried with his wife. Possibly the grave was already full. And I think those are 2 fantastic photographs. I particularly like this one. This one was at a Meet the Royal Ulster Rifles event, and he was the oldest member of the association. And this lad was the youngest member of the Royal Ulster Rifles Cadet Force. He was from Ballymena. Not that that's important. Not that Ballymena isn't important. Where's that shovel? Beechmount Bungalows was the 2nd largest of the Arcon bungalows that were built in Northern Ireland. And 158 bungalows had been erected on vacant ground next to Kennedy Bakery on Beechmount Avenue and they were erected by Logan and Sons. 19 of the original families were still living in the same prefabs in the 1970 street directory, and the 1971 street directory recorded that the whole site was being redeveloped. So whenever you consider these were temporary, you would expect people to be moving in for a few years until they got something better and then moving on. But people stayed in them. Now, if you look in some of the fora, Belfast Forum and so forth, you'll see people coming on saying, oh, they were terrible, they were drafty, they were windy, the water came leaking in. Why did so many people stay in them for so long if they were that bad? On the other hand, you get people saying, I lived in one of those best years of my life, sort of thing. You probably find it somewhere between the two extremes, like everything else. So it was all gone by 1971. Probably the most well-known, and I only found out about this about 2 weeks ago. Jerry Fitt was the occupant at number 59 Beachmount Bungalows in the 1955 street directory. He was a clerk. He'd been in the Merchant Navy from 1941 to 1953, and, well, we all know what happened to him after that. Elevated to the peerage and so forth. In 1960, he was living at Annandale Street, and then for a long part of his life, he lived on the Antrim Road, which Annandale Street is off. So he possibly only lived at Beachmount Bungalows for maybe 2 or 3 years, but still, I was really surprised when I came across that. I thought, whoa. In 1956, an accidental fire destroyed the prefab at 33 Beachmount Bungalows, leaving William Macaulay, a textile worker, his wife, and their 5 children, who were aged between 30 months and 16 years, homeless. This is Mr. Macaulay standing, looking in the ruins of his Arcon prefab. On the map, the 1959, 69, 61 map, there's no building, there's no drawing of a building at that location because the Arcon had gone, the site had been cleared. River Terrace. 13 prefabs were erected on vacant ground on either side of the Lock House on River Terrace, and again by Logan and Sons, completed by the 31st of August 1947. By 1970, 7 of the prefabs had been dismantled. 2 were vacant, in other words, people had been moved out and they were ready for dismantling. And 4 were still occupied. All the River Terrace prefab sites were recorded as vacant ground in the 1975 street directory. Only 1 prefab was occupied by the same family throughout its lifetime. Norman and Isabel Clements lived at number 17 from 1948 to 1970. The Northern Ireland Spastic Association, apologies, I should have given you a trigger warning there. You wouldn't get away with calling it that nowadays, but that's what it was called then. And they were using the prefab for either for accommodation or for office space. And they were there from 1971 to 1974. This is Norman and Isabel Clements. That's not Norman, okay? That's Isabel, and that's Norman, just to avoid any, and this is the 2 of them in later life. I think both of those photographs are fantastic. I particularly like this one. Do you see what he has in his right hand? A wee fag. Okay, you're in the army, you're overseas somewhere hot, you have a fag in your hand. Norman Hannah Clements was born on 1st November 1921 at Scarver Street in Banbridge, to Joseph Clements at Tinsmith and Ellen McCallum. Isabel Lavery was born on 18th December 1920 at Hunter Street in Belfast to Samuel Kinnan Lavery and Sarah Jane Gallagher. Norman enlisted with the Royal Irish Fusiliers in 1938 and was stationed in Lancashire when he married Isabel on 14th November 1942. Don't know what Isabel was doing in Lancashire in 1942, but it's quite possible that she was either serving as a nurse or was working in a munitions factory. I know there were munitions factories in and around Barrow and Furness and that district in both World Wars. Norman served with the 1st Battalion of the Royal Irish Fusiliers in North Africa with the 1st Army and in Sicily and Italy with the 8th Army. He was wounded in Italy in late 1944 and was serving with the Royal Army Service Corps when he was discharged. Norman and Isabel were living at Tonic Fold in Bangor, the old Tonic Cinema. Who remembers the old Tonic Cinema? A few people. When they died, they both died in 2011. Isabel on 4th July and Norman on 24th November. Mrs. Alice Murray was the last occupant, and she lived at number 15 River Terrace, which is this bungalow here. Bing, that's right. Logan and Sons erected 72 prefabs at Stranmillis Embankment and Botanic Gardens by 31st August 1947. Because these houses were being erected by the corporation and because they were supposed to be temporary, quite often the corporation made use of its parks or green spaces or allotments. The ones on Shore Road, a lot of the land that was given up for those bungalows had been civic allotments, and they were turfed off. See what I did there? Turfed off allotments. So the people, and they weren't too happy, of course, because they were losing their allotments, and men need somewhere to go to get away from the children. Where's that shovel? So part of it was built on what was the fringes of Botanic Gardens and also part of Botanic Gardens. When it was eventually dismantled, it was dismantled to make way for the Ulster 71 Exhibition Centre. Does anyone remember that? Which is now the Queen's PE Centre. And I think possibly part of it later became tennis courts. But again, you can see the way it's strung out along there. And that's Botanic Primary School up here, I think. Sorry? Yeah. These historic maps are fantastic. Again, these are coming from the OSNI online, but I've been going through the maps that are held at PRONI trying to get better quality images. Unfortunately for these ones, it goes over two maps, two sheets, so I'm having to try and join them together. Photoshop's great. Thomas Henry Cowden, a civil servant, was recorded as the occupant at number 68 from 1968 to 1970, and he was the last of the original occupants. He was born in 1900 at some place in India. To Thomas Cowden, who was a soldier, and Martha Taylor. Thomas Henry Cowden enlisted with the Royal Irish Rifles and was deployed to France with 15th Battalion on 5th October 1915. He was 15 years and 238 days old. The minimum age for being sent to a theatre of war was 18. You could enlist if you were 16, but you were kept on home service duties. So he's probably a big strapping lad, and he got away with telling them that he was 18. He wasn't sent home. I don't know whether they ever found out, but he stayed on the Western Front until he was transferred to the Class Z Army Reserve on the 24th of May 1919. He was appointed as a clerical assistant in the Northern Ireland Civil Service in October 1953 and was the secretary of the Ormeau Military Band in 1955. To give you some perspective, Kingsbridge and Ormeau Bridge, but you can probably tell from the curve of the lagan. And this is another fantastic photograph from the newspapers. Belfast Newsletter reported that the last remaining prefab at Botanic Bungalows was to be vacated at 10 a.m. on 16th April 1971. The occupants at number 29 were Brendan O'Neill, a corporation bus conductor, his wife Florence, and their three children, Gerard 15, Fiona 11, and David 8. The O'Neill family moved across the Kingsbridge into a new bricks and mortar house in Whitehall Parade off Sunnyside Street. The buildings in the background you can see there would be the Holy Lands, if that helps to give you any sense of the image. 19 Arcon prefabs were erected at the junction of Stranmillis Road and Stranmillis Embankment. Again, Aidan sent me a photograph of these, but it's really a photograph of a bus parked in front of the houses. This is Stranmillis College, and this is Lockview Road, heading down to the Belfast Boat Club and so forth. and that's the roundabout. Can't remember what that building there is. They were erected by the end of August 1947. In the 1973 directory, 7 prefabs were still occupied, and all the prefabs had been dismantled by 1975, and most of the site is now a public car park. And there's Mrs. Violet Buchanan, number 3, and she was the last resident. She died at her bungalow on sometime between 21st and 25th February 1974. So in other words, she had been lying in the house and nobody knew exactly when she died, but they knew it was sometime in that 4-day period. She had lived in the bungalow since 1966. And that's where number 3 was. On the other side of the King's Bridge were the bungalows that were erected at Sunnyside Street. They were erected by David A. Higgins and Sons of Cable Road in Whitehead, who tendered £33,782, 11 shillings and 3pence to clear the land, prepare the site, and erect the prefabs. That's just over 1.2 million in current terms. So it's quite an undertaking. 92 prefabs were erected. The tender was accepted on 1st October 1946, and 43 prefabs had been erected by 1948. 42 of the prefabs had been dismantled by 1970. 12 were still occupied in 1973, and there was no entry for the Sunnyside bungalows in 1974. So you can see how quickly, once they decided these bungalows have to go, it didn't take them long to dismantle them. They were prefabs. They could be dismantled. And in fact, the Arcon prefabs, when they were dismantled, the company employed to dismantle them had the right to sell them, but not for residential purposes. So in one occasion that I know of, a fisheries down in the Republic of Ireland were using it for angling and so forth, and they bought them for people to use as weekend accommodation. Some sports clubs bought them to use as changing rooms. In Portadown, several of the Arcon prefabs became church halls or were used for church activities. Others were bought by farmers to be used for either storing equipment or for small livestock like chickens and pigs. So there might still be some of these Arcons floating about somewhere in somebody's farmyard. But if there are, I don't know about any of them. Amongst the last occupants was the family of Hugh and Annie McNall at number 75. Hugh was a foreman, and the family moved to one of the Hawksley prefabs at Sydenham. Hugh and Annie were living at 48 Invernoot Park when their eldest son Hugh drowned while swimming at Cultraw on 12th August 1977, aged 16. Avonale Road, 7 Arcon prefabs erected on vacant land beside Avonale Junior Public Elementary School, as it was called then. The school had only been built in the 1940s. In the 1969 street directory, there's only one remaining occupant, Mrs. Eileen Quinn at number 64, and all 7 plots were recorded as vacant ground in the 1970 street directory. Conswater Bungalows, 16 Arcon bungalows were erected behind Westminster Avenue and Madison Avenue East. And for those of you familiar with East Belfast, that's where the Arches Health Centre is now. 1969 directory records that all the dwellings were still occupied, but there was no entry for 1970. So there, again, in the space of a year, people had been moved on to other accommodation, Arcons dismantled, and sites cleared. 5 of the original 1949 occupants were still recorded as living at the same prefab in 1969. One of them was John Blair Gibb, a fitter's helper who lived at number 14. On 4th January 1957, he was working at Hughes Tool Company when a packing case being carried by a labour-saving machine, forklift truck, fell on his hand. The little finger had to be amputated and he received compensation of 250 quid. 250 quid for that. And that's approximately, well, nearly 5 grand in current terms. 8 Arcon prefabs were erected at Park Avenue near Victoria Park. So again, if you're trying to get orientation, which I am now trying to do, Park Avenue is coming down here, swings round, and then goes over the railway lines or under the railway track into Victoria Park. That was a band hall. Where am I? Yep, 8 prefabs erected. Occupants first recorded in 1949. 7 prefabs were still occupied in 1971 street directory, but all 8 plots were vacant ground by 1972. None of the occupants listed in the prefabs in 1949 were still present in 1971. No. Samuel and Florence Wellington were living at Nissen Hut 20 in Victoria Park when their son Samuel died at the Northern Ireland Fever Hospital on 18th June 1951, aged 1. The Wellington family moved to Park Avenue bungalows around 1953. He's recorded as the occupant in 1954. And Samuel was still the recorded occupant in the 1971 street directory. So although there were no original 1949 occupants, there were still occupants, or at least one occupant, from 53 through to demolition. He was born in February 1923 to Robert Wellington and Sarah Sinnerton, and he was a machinist when he married Florence Agnes Napier on 5th June 1944 at St. Patrick's Church in Ballymacarrat. They later lived at Knocknagonie Drive. One of the other large sections was, and this was designed to honour Winston Churchill. Not. A wee titter. 96 Arcon bungalows were erected again on the rim, basically, of Orangefield Park, and they were completed by August 1947. 30 had Houston Park addresses, so there were already houses on one side of Houston Park, all semi-detached, and then the Arcons were on the other side, which was on Greenland, before Mr. Trump decided he wanted it. There was only one occupant left at Houston Park in 1968, and that was Mr. Leslie McQuaid, a storeman at number 12, which was one of the ones right down near the end. The other 66 were named as Orangefield bungalows. So those are all Orangefield bungalows, those were Houston Park. All the Orangefield bungalows were occupied in 1967, and there was no entry in 1968. The only occupants throughout the lifetime of those prefabs were Thomas and Annie Kirk at number 68. Thomas Henry Kirk, a painter, died at the prefab on 24th June 1964, aged 66. So that's all the Arcon prefabs, with a specific concentration on the ones in Belfast. There were Arcon prefabs all over Northern Ireland. So the Hawksleys, a very different kettle of fish from the Arcons, in my considered opinion, being an expert on these matters, having studied it for 4 months or thereabouts. Right, where are we? The Hawksley semi-detached. It was a semi-detached aluminium prefab bungalow manufactured by A.W. Hawksley of Gloucestershire, which was a subsidiary of the Bristol Aeroplane Company. Bristol's made bombers for the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. The prefabs for Northern Ireland were to a new design in which the panels had a uniform size and could be packed flat for transportation. So as I said, when the wee video was running, an entire, everything that was needed to erect one prefab and fit it out could fit on the back of one truck. And I'm not talking about a big Arctic. The foam previous versions of the Hawksley had foam cement between the aluminium exterior and the interior lining. But this was now replaced by fiberglass blanket material for the houses in Northern Ireland, which would provide better insulation. So you can see this is a architect's impression of how they would look, which wasn't too far off how they did look. This is one of the Hawksley aluminium prefabs at White Rock. This is a painting, obviously by Vincent Malone. They were defined as being permanent dwelling with a 60-year lifespan. So in 1950. Each dwelling had a frontage of 36 feet and 10 inches and a depth of 25 feet, giving a floor area of 912 square feet. The bungalow had a living room measuring 18 feet by 12 feet, 2 bedrooms with the same dimensions, a third bedroom measuring 12 feet by 7 feet, so even bigger than your box room that you would get in a house today. A kitchen, a bathroom with a water closet toilet. The fireplace in the living room provided convection heating to the 3 bedrooms, and the kitchen was fully fitted with cabinets, cooker, fridge, boiler washer, immersion water heater. This is the fire being installed. It reminds me a bit of the Rayburn, if anyone remembers those, the glass fronted, with the wee tray at the bottom where you could move the slider across to let air in. And this is the kitchen. That's probably the washing machine, and that's the cooker being slotted in. I love these old photographs because they really tell a story. So much so that I've lost my place. Again, I've plotted the locations using Google My Maps of all the 2,000 Hawksleys that were erected in Northern Ireland. There are still 2,000 erected. There are still 1,026 Hawksley prefab bungalows that are being lived in today. They had a lifespan of 60 years in 1950, and they're now, 75 years? And people are still living in them. They've been modified extensively, of course. A lot of them have had exterior cladding put onto them, but to be living in a prefab in the 21st century, to be living in a mid-20th century prefab at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century is, to me, mind-boggling. Most of the prefabs, as I said, are still there. All the ones in Belfast have been removed, although there are still some in White Abbey and Monkstown. All the ones in Ballymena have been removed, and some of the ones in Londonderry. There were 2 Hawksley estates in Londonderry, one in Cregan, one in the Glen estate, and some of them were removed, but the others weren't. And I could understand why a corporation or a council would get rid of all of them, but not why they would get rid of some and keep others. But then, that's councils for you. 802 of the 2,000 Hawksley bungalow prefabs for Northern Ireland were erected at 5 sites in Belfast. 400 were erected at Taughmona, 100 at White Rock, and the remainder were at 3 sites in East Belfast that were relatively close together. There were 132 at Sydenham, 134 at Garnerville, and 36 at Ashfield. In addition, 60 Hawksley bungalows were built at Monkstown and White Abbey. And as I said, all of the Belfast ones are gone, but within a few miles of Belfast city centre, you can still go to Abbeyville in White Abbey and you can see prefabs there. By April 1949, the necessary preparatory work had been completed at the Sydenham and Garnerville sites, and the first 4 aluminium prefabs arrived at Larne on board MV Empire Cedric, and they were taken straight to Sydenham for erection at Inverary Avenue. This newspaper photograph shows the concrete base. the dividing wall between two rooms, an interior wall and an exterior or part of an exterior wall. So the doorway would be just to this side of those two windows. And this shows the first two Hawksley prefabs that were erected in Northern Ireland. They had 3 windows, a doorway, 2 windows, and then 2 windows, a doorway, 3 windows. And there was also a doorway and a window at the kitchen. The door looks very narrow, but it could just be the perspective of the photograph. Inverary Avenue, 132 prefabs within that red boundary. There were 10 prefabs at Inverary Avenue, and David Blair and Annie Cardwell lived at number 26 from 1951 to 1981. 3 prefabs were still occupied in 1981, and all had been dismantled by 1984. There were 10 prefabs at Inverary Drive, and 4 prefabs were still occupied in the 1980 street directory. All the plots had been dismantled and cleared by the time of the 1981 directory. Inverness Parade had 10 prefabs, and 2 adjacent prefabs were being used as a community centre from about 1973 to 1977. So families were being moved out in the early 1970s, but rather than immediately dismantling them, they made use of these units for other purposes. In this case, they were used as a community centre. In other places, they were used to provide playgrounds or play areas for children. In West Rock, 2 of them became an ex-servicemen's club. West Rock, Falls Road, ex-servicemen's club. It somehow doesn't quite gel. And when you see some of the photographs of the prefabs at West Rock, there's one photograph that I remember, and every house had a black flag flying from it. So this must have been around about the early 1980s at the time of the hunger strikes. The last occupant here was at Inverness Parade was Hugh John Gamble, a joiner, who lived at number 11 from 1950 until he died on 30th January 1981, aged 61. 30 prefabs at Inverleith Drive, first recorded in 1950 street directory, and all had been dismantled by 1981. The last occupant was William K. Culbert at number 3, who had lived there from 1976 to 1980. David and Agnes Butler lived at number 21 from 1950 to 1980. David was an electrician, and he served as a radio operator with the Royal Court of Signals in India, Burma, and the Far East during the Second World War. I've plenty more about him, but I know there's a time issue. The largest concentration at Sydenham, was the 44 prefabs at Invernook Park, first recorded in the 1950 street directory, and the first vacant plots appeared in the 1977 street directory, so 27 years later. 1981, there were 13 prefabs. 13 of the 44 prefabs were still occupied, but all had been dismantled by 1984. Only 2 of the families recorded in the 1950 street directory were still present in 1981. The Sloan family at number 40 and the Anderson family at number 46. Inverwood Gardens, the 1950 street directory records that 28 prefabs were being built at this location. In 1974, 2 adjacent bungalows were being used as a community centre. None of the original tenants were still living in the prefabs when they were dismantled in 1976. Ashmount Park, there were prefabs built here by both ministry, but also by a private contractor from James McCready of Craiga. And that's why the Hawksley prefabs are here, here, and here, but they're surrounded by, or they surround other housing that was being built at around about the same time, which makes going through the street directories very difficult. Robert Cleland Adams, a fitter, was recorded as the occupant at number 88 in the 1951 street directory, and he was living at the same address when he died on 7th December 1978 at the age of 77. The 1950 street directory records that 10 prefabs had been erected at, I lost my place. 1950 street directory records that 10 prefabs had been erected at Garnerville Road, and others were in the process of being erected. I'm going to shoot through these quite quickly. This is the Garnerville estate, which again Aidan Campbell has provided me with a great photograph of. So these are all the various little streets. In fact, I'll just go back. So 6 were on Garnerville Road, 20 at Glendew Park, although the whole estate became known as the Glendew estate in some areas by some people. 8 at Glenlee Grove, 22 at Glenlee Park, 50 at Glenlock Gardens, and you can see that they've been shaped and they're not just straight lines. Somebody had a bit of a brainwave, I think. Thought, ooh, let's put them in a shape. And 18 at Glenluce Drive. And the others were at Glenluce Green. They had all been dismantled by 1984. The largest, that's Garnerville site, and again, that's a fantastic photograph showing the prefab. It shows how closely together they were, but it also shows that some of them had relatively nice gardens. I'm getting self-conscious that everyone's leaving now. Largest concentration of prefabs was at 400 Hawksley prefabs at Tockmona in leafy South Belfast. They were erected at 14 streets. I'm not going to go through them all. In fact, I'm going to skim through a lot of it. Finbank Gardens, there were 30 prefabs there, 52 at Finnis Drive. In the centre of the estate, there was a green area, a church and a hall, and on one side there were 2 prefabs and a set of shops. So the shops were here, and then on the other side there was housing. 34 of the 44 prefabs in Marlborough Gardens were still occupied in 1981, and all of them had been dismantled by 1984. One of the long-term occupants were David and Emma Shirlow at number 46. They had married in 1938 at Townsend Street Presbyterian Church, and David Shirlow is commemorated on the memorial tablet in that church for those who survived Second World War and came home. So that's a quick run through. These are some of the others, but I realise we're pressed for time. 100 Hawksley prefabs at West Rock, White Rock. 50 were at West Rock Drive, 30 at West Rock Gardens, and 16 at West Rock Parade. Ernest and Sarah Tewton and their family lived at number 60 West Rock Drive from 1951 to 1981. In 1973, an armoured car, a Humber armoured personnel carrier, what was it known as? Pig. Well done. Had a blowout and took the gable end off the house. So in this newspaper photograph, this is Mrs. Sarah Tewton holding the wee Doug. This is her son Samuel. That's their piano. And basically the whole end of the house was just sheared off. But that was 1973. They stayed in the house for another 9 odd years. Not with the open end. Not with the open end. Sarah Tewton died July 1981, and Ernest, who was a member of RAOB, Royal Ancient Order of Buffaloes, Jubilee Lodge number 7328, and he died on 3rd December 1981, aged 87. This is another of the families. 2 of the 30 prefabs at West Rock Gardens were still occupied in 1989. So nearly 40 years after being erected. The Menon family had lived at number 8 from 1951 to 1989. There was no entry in the 1990 street directory for any of the even-numbered properties, and Henry Ogle Menon had married Margaret Denny on 3rd August 1941, and they moved to West Rock Gardens around 1950. Mrs. Elizabeth Kirkpatrick, a daughter of Henry and Margaret, was abducted from 8 West Rock Gardens on 13th May 1983 by the Irish National Liberation Army, amid speculation that her husband Harry Kirkpatrick had, quote, turned informer. The INLA demanded that Harry Kirkpatrick retract his statement implicating 44 members of the INLA in return for the release of Elizabeth. 4th June, Harry Kirkpatrick was jailed for life after he pleaded guilty to 5 murders and a series of other terrorist-related charges. It doesn't say whether he recanted his informing of his comrades. Father Dennis Fall acted as an intermediary and brought Elizabeth back to her parents' house on the evening of 25th August. So she was held by the INLA in various locations in Northern Ireland and the Republic for something like 105 days. Ah, the good old days, eh? This is a photograph of some of the White Rock prefabs with a nice little Austin Mini in there. In 1986, all 16 prefabs at West Rock Parade were still occupied. Thomas Cush was the occupant at 10 West Rock Parade from 1951 to 1986, so 35 years, and was the occupant at one of the replacement houses in West Rock Gardens in 1988. So even when people moved out of the prefabs, they didn't go that far. They just sort of moved around the corner into a new house. Thomas was born on 24th February 1920 at Scott Street to Felix Cush and Alice Campbell, and he married Alice McCourt on 30th May 1942 at St. Vincent's Church in Birmingham. Again, it's possible that they were both in Birmingham or in England on war service. Brian, an infant son of Thomas and Alice Cush, died at 10 West Rock Parade on 8th December 1953 in the first year of his life. Thomas and Alice Cush later lived at 12 West Rock Court, where Alice died on 24th September 1994, aged 76, and Thomas died on 5th April 2005, aged 85, and they are buried in the Glenlane Extension at Belfast City Cemetery. Finished. Overrun.